Here we go. Welcome, Max. How you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me, eh? This is exciting.
No problem at all. I'm really looking forward to getting stuck in. So, Max is the founder of Hive Tracks. Before we dive into exactly what that is, it'd be brilliant if you could just do a super quick introduction into yourself and also tell me where you're dialing in from.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick background about myself. So I have a background in rural development and food and resource economics. So started, you can think of it as like an agricultural economist, if you will, with a little bit of a rural touch to it. Fairly international background. I studied in Belgium and South Korea. And then I started my career working for the UN, for the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, Italy, which was nice because the office sort of like overlooks the Colosseum and the Circo Massimo, so that was always a dream of mine to be in contact with a bunch of people from all over the world. And working with smallholder producers all over the world in research and extension. And that sort of led me to understanding better what technologies we need to help smallholder producers. And also sort of the big gaps that we see in nature data today. And today, actually, I'm calling in from Western North Carolina. It's a small college town called Boone in the Blue Ridge Mountains. So there's a bit of a story to how I ended up here, but it's a magnificent place and actually very, very biodiverse. So it's a nice place to be to work on biodiversity and bees.
Awesome. Okay, I think that's going to be the theme of today, bees. I'm really interested to know what led you to founding Hive Tracks. Was there a specific moment, an insight, a spark? Where did it come from?
I think there's a few things that happened. I mean, working for the UN, I realized sort of like a couple of core things. So first off, that the data that we are relying on is very stale in a sense. There's very little data that is available continuously that is being collected and allows us to monitor biodiversity in nature. It's sort of there's this like glooming crisis, and we know sort of insects are in decline, pollinators are in decline, land use are changing, but we are lacking the granular data. And then at the same time, we have millions of smallholder producers who go out every day and are in these spots and go there every day or every week because they're tending to the land in one way or the other. And that was sort of like the gap that I saw that I wanted to bridge and understand sort of, okay, could we connect those two needs, basically the needs that smallholder producers have to solve their everyday problems, and then in particular the data gap that we have. And when you look at ecosystems and ecosystem health, pollination is really the backbone in a sense, and it kind of glues it together. So as an ecosystem service, if you will, that really ensures kind of the integrity and the diversity of our flowering plants. I mean, over 90% of flowering plants are dependent upon animal pollination. Over 3/4 of the food we produce is dependent upon animal pollination. So it's very a core thing, but much of it is sort of invisible. So part of my work was equipping beekeepers and working with beekeepers. At one of the conferences, I met two professors from Appalachian State University that are over here that had worked within bees and on bees for quite a while. And I was really intrigued. I was like, well, here's actually something that we could do together. So we worked remotely for about a year, got to know each other before we started to incorporate with this idea of like building a tool that beekeepers in particular could use to keep track of the health of their hives, and at the same time with that basically create a data layer that would understand us how ecosystem resilience changes and how that becomes relevant to make economic decisions.
Okay, so I think you've kind of lent into it a little bit there, that there's kind of two sides to the business, or two outcomes. So one is that you're serving the beekeeper, and two, in that process, by serving the beekeeper, you're getting a huge amount of data, and with that data you can kind of track biodiversity and a huge amount of nature metrics. Is that right? Is it?
Yeah.
I guess the question that I'm kind of leading on to is, for those that don't really know, I've got a sort of base level understanding, but there's quite a lot of intricate detail here that I could get myself lost in. But for those that don't know, it'd be brilliant if you could just break down, what is the model around Hive Tracks? How does it work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So sort of HiveTracks started off with focusing on what's happening inside the hive, right? So it's really understanding sort of what are the core, hive-specific, colony-specific metrics, data that determine the health of a hive. So really determine one, sort of what's the overwinter survival rate? So how do we ensure that the hive colony stays healthy to get through winter? And then what is the production capacity? So how do we ensure that there's enough honey that is being produced? Very quickly that led to an understanding that obviously the health of a hive is dependent upon the environment surrounding it. And there's a couple of factors there. So first off, understanding what blooms, so basically the diversity in flowering species and how pollinator friendly, so how pollen and nectar producing they are. And then obviously also understanding that the health of a hive is sort of like an indicator, a biosensor, if you will, to understand how the ecosystem is doing overall. So with the advancements of AI and the ability specifically with computer vision algorithms to determine what is blooming and what is crawling, flying, pollinating in terms of insects, that's how we've augmented the app over time to be able to have a methodology that actually allows us to capture plant-specific biodiversity, pollinator-specific biodiversity, and then the health of the hive. So that's essentially the beekeeper side. So a tool that makes it very easy to follow on the health and track what is moving and what is happening in the direct environment of the hive, and then what actions the users can take to basically improve the setup or the framework within which the bees operate. And then on the other side, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
On that, because I've always had a dream of keeping bees.
Nice.
It's not something that I've kind of done yet, but I know the time will come. So I don't actually know the sort of intricate detail. I know it's really technical, and there will be a huge amount to learn and courses to go on. But what are the little tweaks that your data can kind of tell someone that there's a problem or an area of improvement? What are the little tweaks that a beekeeper can make in order to improve their hive?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So there's the cornerstone of basically beekeeping is the so-called hive inspection. So that's when you take an assessment of the health of a hive. And we have a methodology in the app that guides people through. You can think of it as like 4 succinct areas. It has to do with the population size. So dependent upon where you are in the season, you have to have like a minimum population, and the stronger the population, the healthier the hive. Next, you start to look at the food stores, which obviously there's a direct correlation. The more food stores there are, meaning how much foraging do the bees have in the surrounding, the bigger the population. And that directly leads to a feeding, right? If there's not enough foraging around or the population isn't strong enough, so feeding is one of the big aspects, the big actions that a beekeeper can take. Then we look at the different brood stages, so understanding sort of like, are all the stages of brood, so larva, capped brood, uncapped brood, do you have the different stages so you know that the colony is reproducing healthily? And then lastly, you may have read about this, is any type of stressors, right? So this could be the biggest one for beekeepers that they're struggling with is varroa mites, which are little nasty mites that sit on the bee. They basically sit on the tummy of the bee. And are a huge issue and an issue to bee health. So there's management practices that need to be taken. So essentially looking at these 4, so again looking at population, food stores, brood stages, and the stressors is basically determined if everything is looking good or if there's some actions that need to take place. And in particular, that's sort of where the magic happens, because all a beekeeper wants to know is like, is this normal? Am I doing this right? And what should I be doing next? And there the app helps with like smart recommendations and goes through and says either this is what other people are doing or here's what you can do to follow up, right? Whether you feed or you treat or you manage varroa in some kind of way, you got to come back a little bit later to see if that's still the case. And of these inspections we've recorded over in the last 18 months, we've had over 100,000 unique inspections now that people have recorded. So we're starting to get like a good data set that we can train a model on to really become sort of the AI assistant for beekeepers to determine based on what they see in the hive, here's what you can do to ensure that your hive stays as healthy as possible.
Okay, amazing. So that's on the beekeeper side, and with 100,000 inspections, I mean that's amazing. 100,000 inspections. How many users have you got on?
So over the last 18 months, it's been about 20,000 users across 150 countries, and that's about just shy of 20,000. And the core thing, what is exciting about it, is how global and local beekeeping is at the same time. So wherever there's vegetation, wherever there's plants, there's likely bees and there's likely beekeepers. And it differs around, it's across cultures, across different vegetations, whether that's sort of like in the north of England or in the south of America or all the way to Eastern Africa. And what usually changes, I would say about 80% of the beekeeping is the same. And then what really differs is the type of hives, for example, that people have, the type of bees that people carry, and that's one of the most exciting aspects. So like see how people all over the world are picking up the app, are using it. We're available in about 9 languages now, smaller ones and larger languages. And that's sort of like the love for bees as a unit cause and as a almost an interface, right? It's like a human biodiversity interface, the way that people connect with nature is incredibly rewarding to watch.
I bet. And how many beekeepers are there in the world? Do you have that?
Yeah, there's about 10 million beekeepers managing about 100 million colonies. So it really depends on kind of like, you can beekeepers obviously vary depending on whether you're a hobbyist. Sideliner is what they're called in the US. So those are like people who have up to 500-ish hives. And then the commercial beekeepers who live off of, it's like major businesses that can in the US have up to 100,000 hives.
Okay, cool. So that's incredible to hear on kind of where you're adding value and in that process. I imagine word of mouth is a pretty powerful tool once you get into these networks, and the word spreads and it's kind of friends telling friends on kind of how they're doing things. What is the other side of it? So we've talked about the fact that you've talked about 20,000 users over the last 18 months. You've had 100,000 unique inspections. There's a lot of data that's coming out of that. And I know the other side of the business is around what you can do with that data and what that can tell you about biodiversity and the nature and the environment around. Yeah, what does that side of the business look like?
Yeah, that's actually, it's a very exciting piece. And we've always figured out, or we're working on ways of how can we do revenue shares with the beekeepers so that, when they collect specific data in specific sites, is that something that can tell us a thing or two about the environment that is specific to businesses. And that's exactly what we're doing now, where we're understanding companies approach us or work with us to understand their specific impact on nature in a given site. And in particular, one of the big use cases right now is brownfield development. So understanding sort of their specific environmental remediation needs, right? So when we look at a specific site that could have been contaminated in one way or the other, some of the sites are, they've been contaminated terribly, right? They've been contaminated in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. That was before there was any environmental regulation that was in place. So it was really a time and space. So these companies are now have these sites. They may not necessarily be responsible for them because they may have acquired a different company that owned these sites back in the 50s and 60s and are now tasked with remediating these. And what we are noticing is that companies have very little data on the outcomes, right? So they have no means to understanding if they perform certain remediations, what does that do on biodiversity, right? Is the number of species increasing? Is the number of flowering plants increasing? Is bee health increasing for that area? So essentially what we do there is we team up with the customer and a beekeeper in our network who is local, and then the beekeeper places their hives on site and uses our app and the guided methodology to collect, this is getting a little technical, to collect mean species abundance data, right? So floral diversity, floral abundance, pollinator diversity, and pollinator abundance, using a stratified sampling strategy. So we basically run an algorithm on the map. We determine where the points are to collect the specific data, to have a science-backed assessment around these biodiversity metrics around plant and pollinators and then bee health. And then we do a revenue share with the beekeeper who gets paid for the honey that they produce and the time that they need to collect the data on the specific site. And then on the tail end, we use an IoT scale underneath the hive that tells us the foraging productivity basically of the hive. So how much honey do they produce, meaning how much nectar do they collect from the flowering plants in the area. And then doing lab testing of both the pollen and the honey to understand how much of the biodiversity on site shows up in the pollen that the bees collect, and whether there is any additional pesticide residuals or any sort of heavy metals that could be contaminating the honey or the pollen.
Okay, so you actually you're taking sort of samples of the pollen, and then you're taking that into a lab, and you can kind of look into it to look at plant species and all of the kind of the nasties that might be in there or might not be in there, and from that you've got a clear picture of the health of the local ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. So we essentially, the core data collection is image based, right? So it's all through the smartphone. It's location, elevation, and stamped images. And then we sort of like, that's the ground truth thing. And we can always go back to these images. So it's a very auditable and sort of like a, self or, a DIY approach, if you will, because the guidance that happens in the app is so methodological and is sort of peer reviewed. And then what happens is the lab testing exposed allows us to cross-reference and benchmark against the entire user base and against the specific site and the images that were recorded. So if you think of it, this ground truthing procedure allows us to close the last mile of remote sensing, right? Because we sort of like have this distributed network of images that are being located that allow us to determine sort of what happens below the canopy, where a satellite, for example, is not able to look below the canopy or take a picture of a bee.
Yeah, amazing. So I love it. It makes so much sense because you're going out and you're looking after the beekeepers that want to know how to make the best honey, and then effectively at the same time you're putting the bees to work, and they're coming back with all the data, and from that you can do so much. So going into the kind of next phase, because I think I understand the two sides and how you're using that. What does the business model look like? Where do you draw revenues from?
Yeah, so right now we work with larger companies. It could be solar developers or larger corporations that have these specific remediation needs or offsetting needs, either in greenfield development, right? So if a solar developer wants to put a new solar development in place, they have to navigate the relationship with a landowner, for example, and they have to prove how they're going to tend to the land, right? That they have a plan in place to make sure that when they lease the land for 20, 30, 40 years, that there is a plan in place that the underlying value won't degrade. So that's the business model in that is to build out the number of sites that we have under management so that we can support more beekeepers, more bee populations. And then these corporations pay us, it's usually a 3-year contract because you work with nature. So you need to have a year for baselining, then you have some data-driven recommendations based on what you can do on site that are implemented in year 2, and then you can look at the delta in year 3. This is the first contracts are coming through this year. And we have the first roughly 10 sites live with beekeepers placed and data flowing. And that's what we're heavily focused on. So really understanding and working with more corporates, more brownfield owners to get out there and basically increase the network that we have and make the data collection even simpler, right? To make really like turn nature engagement into the data collection. So the core focus is building out the site-specific monitoring, as at the same time we obviously are very focused on understanding what are the data collection requirements. So can we map out to reporting requirements, anything either on a local level, so working with municipalities, on a state level, all the way up to global reporting standards, so that we can map our data to any kind of reporting standard that a company may have to make it very easy to fit our data collection methodology into what they're already doing or what already exists in the marketplace. We really want to be like this plant-pollinator interaction, that layer is something that we believe there's a lot of potential in the farming sector as well. So anything looking at regenerative ag, making it very easy to prove sort of the environmental gains that we're seeing when you reduce input use, for example, or you perform your more regenerative practices. So it's really any kind of pain or gain from improving the relationship with nature. That's what we want to be able to monitor. And then ultimately working.
Jump in there, because there's so much talk about rewilding and improving biodiversity, or talking about where there's problems, but actually there's one thing, there's a lot that we can do with our eyes to see, look, there's more biodiversity in there, and you feel like you can see a few more butterflies and insects and wildlife coming into it, but that's just with the human eye. The truth is with almost everything, the truth is in the data. And so you've managed to kind of put the bees to work like they're known for, and bring back a data source, but which is brilliant. And I totally see the business model. But what are you replacing anything? Are you competing with anything? Or is this just a totally new, is this covering a hole in the market that needed fixing?
I think it's really covering a hole in I think it's equipping a lot of industries, right? It's really something that helps augmenting what environmental consultants at the moment are doing, right? So it's really a layer, much of the analysis that is currently being done, so from satellite and drones, is either, it's not granular enough. Much of the environmental consultancies is not frequent enough. It's a single point in time sort of assessment. So what we try to do is to bring in this sort of continuous layer that just uses the smartphone and a very smart use of AI and a methodology to layer that on top and in between to enable the measurement, as you said, is like to have kind of this auditable data trail of changes in the environment, to be able to market it, to quantify it, to manage it. So anything that happens when you look at monetization as well, you need to have sort of this irrefutable layer that tells you what's the trend, right? So much about it is like compared to last year, compared to 2 years ago, compared to a control site, what are we seeing here? And I think there's a lot of education involved in that because, people are only waking up now. There's a lot of talk about biodiversity in nature, but people are still working to understand there's so many different aspects of what you can look at in biodiversity. We want to make it very, very easy to collect, in a very standardized approach and a like-for-like comparison to involve the plant and pollinated biodiversity data collection. And ultimately what we're working toward is to get to a critical mass and strategic density, that it could become a real marketplace where people basically get kind of like paid data collection requests, where a specific data point needs to be collected in a specific area, which could be a direct payout for users depending on where they are, as we sort of cover the entire world.
A local beekeeper would put their hand up and go, well, I'll go and put a beehive over there and put a tracker on it. I get paid for it, I get honey, and I'm doing something good.
Yeah, exactly. Think of like the little Uber messages. Here's like a new ride. Do you want to accept the message? And that's sort of like what we're working toward to understand, is there a new, is there a new impetus as we work with more and more entities that find these data relevant, looking at, reinsurance, for example, looking at a few other of these industries that are starting to, need to recalibrate their risk models, because many of the risk models either work off of publicly available databases that are a year old or 2 year old or don't get updated as much, or reflect the last 30 years, right? Many of the models are based upon backward looking data, and we know that changes in climate and the environment are just getting more dramatic. So having more, more near real time and ground truth data, we believe has an enormous potential to increase the accuracy of any kind of model that tries to look at climate and nature risk.
And just to sort of, one of the challenges that goes through my head on this, and I'm sure you've got the answer, but from a property developer as an example, they just want to build more properties, more houses, more blocks of flats, and in that sort of capitalist mindset, they're just going, well, actually this sort of nature and environmental thing's slightly in the way. So currently it feels like it's slight sort of finger in the air stuff. That they say, okay, fine, we'll invest in more plants and we'll put some trees in over here and we'll do this and we'll do that. Is Hive Tracks actually calling that out a little bit? So it's not good enough anymore to just put your finger in the air and make almost greenwash people into thinking that it is more biodiverse, where actually you need raw data. So I guess you're coming in and actually saying, here's the base level, and you've made a promise and a commitment by building on this site that you're going to increase the biodiversity, and here's a plan on what you need to do. Are the developers looking fondly upon this, or is this who is it that's kind of putting this forward to suggest that they need to do it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think there's different ways of looking at it. So there's, again, one of the reasons that we work with brownfield and greenfield development is that it's already a massive problem, and there is a huge lack of outcome-specific data to make that happen. And I think part of the work that we do with our early customers is to break it back down of like, what is the bottom line argument, right? So what can I do? Can I reduce the temperature on my property by planting properly? Can I reduce the water use, for example? Can I increase the drought tolerance? Can I increase the wildfire resistance? So there's certain sort of patterns in where it's almost like functional biodiversity, if you think of it. And that's sort of where we get really, really excited. I think we're still a few years out to be able to produce those case studies that show us here is how literally having a smart approach toward biodiversity, creating functional biodiversity hotspots. Here's the hardcore bottom line, the impact, basically, where you can say we actually saved funding by planting this instead of that, or here is another component, or we reduced mowing, or there's specific aspects. And that's really what we're incredibly excited about, to work with our early customers to produce these case studies and to show, look, this is what we implemented, here's the baseline, these were the recommendations that we created, benchmarking that against what did, to make it a pure economical argument, basically, to invest in biodiversity as much as possible.
That's really smart. Yeah, definitely. I think if you can build in that win-win scenario, that actually, that they're winning because you're effectively going to save them cost by enabling them to make smart moves. And nature usually does have the answer. It just, in every way you look at it, it does always come back to that. And then, nature is winning because we're able to track incremental growth and improvement in ecosystems.
Yeah.
Which is brilliant. And so just to keep going on, just diving a little bit deeper onto kind of, the business and the revenue model around that. So who is it that's buying the data?
So the data is bought basically site specifically, right? So it's the same way that there is, it's developers, and again we almost call it the data collection as a service, where they're wanting to understand what is the impact on one site and then across the portfolio. Where we have the revenue share with the beekeepers to look into it, and then we're working to get more and more clarity around sort of like what are the biggest areas and what are the biggest drivers. One thing that we're spending a lot of time on is to understand what can pollinator diversity be an early indicator on, right? So what do we see when we look at soil health, for example, or when we look at sort of other weather patterns, land use, land change? How does that impact pollinator diversity, and what are the easiest fixes to change pollinator diversity through planting regimens, for example, or things like that. So I think anywhere in the built environment is looking at this structurally. And I think that's also when you start to take a step back and you look at the time horizon of the next 25, 30, 40 years. Much of the construction that happens now has these kind of time horizons, and the world will be very, very different 20, 30, 40 years from now. So like the long-term value that's being created, and likely, as you also said, I think we're seeing a lot of the sort of NIMBY components right now, right? Not in my backyard, that there is obviously development firms and who want to create another solar facility or another housing, and more there's either neighborhoods or there's towns that are opposing a new data center, for example, because they have questions around what is the water use going to be, what is the impact on nature going to be. And I think that will require a lot of conversation in between communities that are living in the surrounding areas and understanding what is a compromise that we can work on here. And that's sort of like we want to be the data layer that facilitates that compromise, to be able to say, look, we have a plan in place, we can monitor it, we can engage people. That's something else that we're looking at quite a bit, to go look at people beyond beekeeping, right? So to have people who care for bees, but who would never, you would be the prime example, guys. Like, you've always been wanting to keep bees, but you're not there yet. But people care a lot about what is growing in my garden, what can I do, right? Ever since I've started working with bees, people always ask me, how are the bees doing? What can I do? Right, and that's sort of another thing. Can we facilitate that and help people sort of like do things in their garden or buy products that are bee supportive than bee harming? And that's sort of the next layer for that. So when you look at a construction company that sort of like tries to find a compromise around a certain area that is being built, is there a tool that they can use to monitor and prove that the impact is either offset or that it's kind of like holistically regards what happens in biodiversity? And can the local community be involved and basically have an engaging accountability piece and understanding how bee and pollinator health are improving?
Yeah, I've been doing up an old cottage in Devon, where I'm sometimes based. I'm between Devon and London, and I've kind of let the garden go pretty wild and just sort of cut tracks through it and that kind of stuff. But I would absolutely love to have been keeping bees, because I'm doing that because in my mind I think that I love the look of a wild garden that just let nature do its thing. And then the other piece is that it's kind of been drummed into me that we need to do that because it needs to increase biodiversity. But I've got no data other than that I like the look of it, and it looks like it's more biodiverse. I'm seeing loads more plants, but wouldn't that be amazing if I could have tracked it from what it was, which was just your quite traditional garden that everything's cut back and it's all it's got nice neat edges, and then compare it to what it is now, and then also get, I've got a very busy village WhatsApp, and just say, by the way, I've been tracking the biodiversity, which obviously is, not just my garden, it would be the surrounding people, and here's been the change. If we all did X, Y, and Z, this is what we can do. And I think that just kind of gets people buying into it, because I think we're in a world where everyone knows there's a biodiversity crisis. The UK is especially bad, but we're just being told that. And if we then get some data that sits behind it that's kind of tangible, then we as individuals can react. But obviously, I think the bigger play here is from that, the commercial impact when you're building on brownfield sites and the improvements. And you're seeing the developers come in now and being very proud of their biodiversity, or the way that they're trying to bring nature back into urban areas. I've always been blown away by the work that Canary Wharf does. That is a concrete jungle, but actually right at the centre of it there is a team that really does care about sustainability, and wherever possible they're trying to get plants in there, and they need, beyond looking good, it needs to be trackable, and that's obviously where you guys are coming in. Sorry, go for it.
No, sorry, just one quick thing. I love what you just said, and that's what excites me the most, right? I always compare to, over the last 5 to 10 years, what sort of in health, what the wearables have done, right? Is it an Oura ring or a watch or something? All of a sudden, everybody knows how many steps they're getting in or how many hours of sleep they're getting. And all of a sudden, you become aware because you started measuring something. And that's sort of like what you measure matters, and you need to measure something in order to manage it. And I think that's sort of like having an easy data layer that allows to convert that into pride, right? To be able to say, okay, I can prove what I've done. I can see the change. It's not just a vague understanding of like, oh, I slept quite well. It's like, no, it was actually 8.5 hours, right? Or you can go back and kind of say, look, I have actually 12% more plants than I had 2 years ago, and here's what I did with it. So I think that implementing that in our thinking, right? And I think much of, and this goes into a lot of the more of like sustainability topics, that the normal MO is sort of to do something, and then at the very end you're like, okay, now that we've made the money, or now that we've solved the problem, now we can think about sort of nature or sustainability or something like that. And if we can revert that, and if we can make it part of the thinking from the very beginning, to understand, yep, this is one of the core metrics that we've always understood, right? I'm always thinking about this. Imagine there was like, CEO bonus packages at the end of the quarter that would be tied to an increase in biodiversity. And that would just be a natural mainstream metric that you look at and be like, yep, this is just, biodiversity is just the core metric that everybody looks at and understands and actually evaluates performance against the resiliency of an ecosystem.
We're so driven by data, and we've got data coming out of our ears. Exactly. I love that comparable on, your own human health, when you're looking at all the data that you can collect now, even just from the simplicity of step count. There you go. I know that yesterday I did 10,200 steps, and that my average is 9,500 a day, whereas last year it was 7,500, and that's because I'm running.
Good for you. But imagine that was the case, right? It's like what's the biodiversity step count, right? What's the kind of thing, if you and I can chat, we meet in a bar, and then it's like, you know what? I'm up 11% this year. You have no idea.
Yeah, I fully get it. I get it. Okay, this is making. I understood it coming into this, but when you bring in those sort of comparable case studies that are really tangible, it makes even more sense. And it's just, there's no way you can do this without the epicness of a bee, which is just
there you go.
Way back there.
Yeah, it's it's a keystone species, and it's like it's the ambassador, if you will.
Yeah, good on the bees. We always knew they were good. We didn't realise they were going to play this much of a role. And where are you at? You've got 20,000 users. There's hundreds of thousands of inspections that are happening across 150 countries. Where are you at, sort of commercially as a business? I imagine there's been quite a lot of R&D that's gone into the back of this, but I'm assuming you're revenue generating. And what are the kind of next few phases for the business?
Yeah, we're revenue generating. So as you said, we spent a lot of time on the R&D, getting the models right, getting sort of the relationships with the beekeepers right, making sure that the way we collect the data is science-backed, follows the right methodologies. And now we're sort of in the commercialization phase, starting to work with larger corporates starting this year, We're in the middle of our seed extension round that will allow us to really have the time to work on the pain points with our specific customers in the specific groups, to put the groundwork in place and like expand what we've done, really lean into the growth. I mean, much of what we've done has been word of mouth. We're adding over 1,000 new beekeepers per month to our platform, so it's been growing really strong with really nice ratings, 4.8 on Apple and 4.9 on Google. Like leaning into that and spending a lot of time on improving the ease of data collection is a big one, and then leaning into the commercialization strategy, and as I said earlier, the integration with new AI models and other reporting frameworks. So yeah, my job right now as the CEO and co-founder is to work on the fundraise as much as possible, and working with our early customers to create some strong case studies that allow us to prove out how we've basically used the power of the bees, nature intelligence, to make an impact and track the delta in the trend over time.
Okay, and where, I imagine this isn't your first funding round, where's the kind of funding come from to date to kind of get you to where you are today?
Yeah, we've mostly worked with angel investors and local investment funds here in the southeast of the US. We have a couple of VCs and family offices around the world that have been involved as well. And then a good amount of non-dilutive funding as well that have like finance-specific projects, be that either in Central Asia. We've done work with the German government in Uzbekistan and Ethiopia. And then we've also gotten some grants to build out our Web3 integration. To make sure, and that's sort of like another layer, to be able to validate that the data is auditable, to have a Web3 component in that.
Brilliant. Okay, and what's the kind of looking ahead? So I think we've done quite a lot of kind of deep diving into the development, where it's come from, where you're at, and it kind of that's all really clear, and you've got the two sides of the business. What does the kind of future look like? If you're looking ahead in kind of the 3, the 5, the 10-year increments, where do you think HiveTracks can go?
So yeah, it's the biodiversity step count. That's where we want to be. So to be able to give everybody beyond beekeeping a chance to engage with nature. We want to change the way, revolutionize the relationship that we humans have with nature and make that visible, right? These invisible ecosystem services, the invisible biodiversity that we just by looking at it have an idea, and then move towards sort of having a complete global coverage. Of being able to have a very, very granular window into biodiversity of plants, pollinators, and bee health all over the world. So we want, wherever there is vegetation, we want to have data on and be able to work with users in those areas to be able to have any kind of change, any kind of impact, to become the largest marketplace for environmental data, ground truth environmental data that there is in the world.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I think it's been incredible to kind of dig in and really understand the business. I think my mind's been actually slightly blown on kind of what you could do with this. The size of the opportunity is so important. I think we all know that we need to invest in nature. We need to kind of do everything we can as humans to protect the environment, but we do need to be led by data on what's working, what isn't, and what we all need to be doing, both from a commercial standpoint, but also on that personal level. That brings it back to that simplicity of here's the improvement on my step count, but here's the improvement on nature. I really like the tangibility of that as a comparable. I hope people listening in are getting that, and I think there's a brilliant business model in here, and I'm very confident that in the Blue Earth community that we should be able to find some bee lovers, definitely some investors that will really buy into this, and also from a corporate standpoint, there's a lot of big corporates that we're working with that do want to kind of understand where they can make improvements. So I'm really looking forward to introducing you to people. I introduced you to Sebastian Vettel, the 4 times world champion F1 driver. He spoke at Blue Earth last year. And his big thing was about getting more bees at the F1 tracks. And I bet his mind would be equally as blown by what you're doing with bees. And we've got to get you talking, because I think I would
love that. And we share the same accent too, so that may be fun to connect over that.
There we go. So I'm going to make it my aim to get you talking to Seb. He came to Blue Earth Summit last year. Was originally just going to come for a couple of hours. ended up being, his curious mind was blown. He was there all day and meeting loads of businesses and just getting so stuck in. So he's definitely trying to work out his path in this space, but definitely got his heart in the right place and wanting to do the right things. But I do know that there's a passion for bees in there, so it'd be crazy for us not to make that connection.
I would love that.
Thank you
That
so
would be
much
fantastic.
for explaining. Before we always end on a sort of a bonus question where I always ask the person that's joining us just to talk about another business or a founder that's really inspiring them at the moment. So is there anyone that kind of springs to mind that you're seeing out there in the market doing great things, driving great impact, creating a new business that you think's awesome?
I think there's a few sort of like, you know, inspirational aspects of like, I really appreciate when there's a kind of like a simplicity that changes something, or when there's an interesting turn. I think one of the inspiring stories for me has been like the story of Slack as an example, where it was, you know, it started as a tool that was something completely different, and then by turning the other way around, they started to be something that all the corporates, and it's almost, you know, has replaced email in so many ways. So the story of Stripe, where just a few lines of code all of a sudden changed something. And I think the most inspirational aspect for me in that regard is always that somebody cared, right? Somebody cared to go the extra mile. Somebody cared to not accept the status quo. And that's sort of like what is just deeply inspiring for me. Somebody's like, this should be so much simpler. And that's, I think, something that, you know, keeps all of us entrepreneurs alive. And we find something and are like frustrated with it, but then it takes a specific personality, mindset, and a huge pain tolerance to then say and go, okay, actually, this should be much better. Let me look into this. Let me try to figure this out, and let me see how, you know, we could, one, solve this problem, then make it commercially viable. And that's what inspires me a lot. And then I think the other component is when people do something later in life. I think that's the other. There are a lot of founders who've started their thing in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And that's another aspect of that again, there's no clear linearity in this. It's just something, identifying something, and then all of a sudden waking up in the morning and making it your mission and not letting go until something comes out of it. So that's what I, you know, when you have a rough day, which there are many of as entrepreneurs, those are the quotes and the stories that I listen to and read about to like keep me going.
Awesome. I can definitely see that, because I think, looking in at what you're doing and trying to understand it, there's a deep complexity that you guys are solving behind the scenes. But that simplicity of, and the need for the measurement of nature metrics and fully understanding of, you know, what is actually happening, where can we make improvements, that's you're bringing something so special to the market and is so needed. Massive thank you for everything you're doing. Huge congratulations on what you've built today. It really feels like you're at an exciting point with a, you know, commercial product ready to go with product market fit, that now it's a case of rolling it out. And the more that you roll it out, the more you have the data, the more you can learn, the better it'll get. It definitely feels like you're at a really exciting time with the business. No doubt there's been challenges along the way, but you've been brave enough to give it a go, put the bees to good work, and here we are. So thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to have you a part of our community, a member of Blue Earth Ventures, and I think there's so much that we can do together. So I'm really excited about the future and supporting you guys. So thank you very much.
Guy, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everything that you're doing and what you have done in building up this community. It is a pleasure to be part of this, and I look forward to many more opportunities to work together.
Good stuff. Cheers, Max.
And we gotta, take care, and we gotta get you those bees too.
We have, definitely.
We're gonna get you started. You take care, Guy. Thank you so much.